Hello, MotoAmerica fans. It's time for another episode of Off Track with Carruthers and Bice. You'll laugh, you'll cry, and you may even learn something from this unlikely pair and their special guest. The mic is yours, Paul and Sean.
Hello, MotoAmerica fans. This is Paul Carruthers, and I'm joined today by Sean Bice, and this is the weekly MotoAmerica podcast, Off Track with Carruthers and Bice. Today we have a special guest, and it's not a racer, it's not a crew member, it's a journalist, but a different kind of journalist. Kevin Cameron. A lot of you will know the name. A lot of you, I hope, have read his stuff because you'd be the better of it if you have. The guy studied physics at Harvard, for God's sake. So if he's not the smartest guy we've interviewed, he's got to be definitely close to that, Sean.
Yeah.
He's an author. He's written many books, most of which are technical in nature. He's been an editor at Cycle Magazine, an editor at Cycle World. You've seen his stories in the magazine. You've seen him online. And I've known Kevin in two different phases of life. I knew him as a journalist, and many conversations we've had in the media center over the years, most of which I probably just pretended the entire time to actually understand what he was saying. But that's on me, not on him. And then I also know him from, I guess I would have been, 17, 18 years old and earlier. But my recollection of him is obviously he's the bearded gentleman who did a similar job to my father in that he spent the majority of that part of his life trying to extract as much good things from Yamaha TZs as possible, and that's 250s to 750s. So I'm excited to have him on the show because he's and then also which I even forgot until I was doing a little research, but Kevin worked for me when we did a watercraft magazine at Cycle News, and he did a column for us every month that talked about the technical aspects of watercraft, and he got into the pump. I mean, you can imagine he went all in, and we all learned a lot about personal watercraft that we didn't know before. So there's been several meetings that I have had with Cameron, and they've all been good. And it's exciting for me to have him on the show. And I'd like to get started. It's kind of a big question, but I think it's a question that will get the thing rolling, and we can learn a little bit more about Kevin. But how does somebody go from being a Harvard graduate to what I first remember, Kevin, he was actually tuning Richard Slachter's two-strokes basically in a tent. And I want to say maybe Assen comes to mind, and a muddy field with a small tent and this bearded guy working on these TZs for Richard Slachter. First of all, Kevin, welcome to the show. And am I right in that recollection? And how did that happen?
Absolutely right. What happened there was that we were hooked up with Krauser by Yamaha secret agent, and Krauser invited us to his place near Munich. And Schlachter and I went down there, and we were told, no talking. After breakfast tomorrow, I'll show you to your room. Just be quiet. And the next morning, we were ushered in, and we studied the 100 photographs of sidecar racing. Krauser had been involved with that very deeply in his life. And finally, he came in, and he said, "What do you want?" And it's usual in Europe in those days for the rider to speak and the hired help to remain mute. And poor Schlachter had never encountered anything like this. It's like you go for a job interview and the interviewer says, "Well," and you just gobble. So finally I said, what we need is $2,500 a meeting. Agreed, said Carruthers, to be delivered to you as follows. And the details were quickly arranged, and we were on our way. So what Carruthers didn't like was seeing us in that tent working on the ground. He said, this is unworthy of my money. You must do better. So when we went down to Italy, we bought the things that were missing so that we could put on a better show. And at each race, Carruthers was not there, but one of his representatives would appear with the equivalent of 2,500 US in the local currency, for example, at Assen. And we quickly got used to that. But I had worked that number out on the back of an envelope as we drove through Bavaria. And we came over a hilltop, and two black military jets rushed overhead at quite low altitude. And I thought, oh, yes, well, the Cold War is alive and well.
All right. So how did this is going to be a long answer probably, but how did you come to get involved in motorcycle racing from, as I said, being a Harvard grad?
Well, the thing is, I probably didn't belong in university. I should have gone to one of those places that did a semester of practical work and then a semester of working out how to do better. I think university really wasn't for me. And the reason that I have this reputation for being able to explain in words things that are widely regarded as complicated is because that's how I explain them to myself. But in university, they want you to explain it with mathematics, and I wasn't real good at that. So I may have been at university on false premises because we were all building motorcycles in our college rooms. Take it into the elevator. Well, you have to stand it up on its hind wheel. Take it in the elevator, take it upstairs, get busy. And this was in the Boston area at the time, and most of the motorcycle shops in the Boston area were at least half staffed with people who were taking a year off from their PhD program because they weren't really sure that that was for them. I mean, those were the days when you got out of high school, there you were with your arms hanging down. You had to go to college because that was the next step. So I took it. But the two-stroke engine had always interested me, and I'd done a lot of reading. And in high school, there had been a local racetrack for micro midgets, and we built a few of those. So it was a natural. And a motorcycle, of course, will go in your college room. An automobile won't.
That's right. Hey, Kevin, so here's something I want to ask you about. And I got to inject a little bit of my own thoughts or my own personality into this. So my dad was a mechanical engineer, and I always admired that about him. He's also a woodworker, and I thought I was going to follow in his footsteps. And, you know, I was terrible in math too. So I got in college. Well, at that point I was was riding motorcycles, and I really, really enjoyed them. And it was the mechanical aspects of it. And I've even said to people, sometimes I don't even have to ride a motorcycle to admire it. I can sit there and look at it. But anyway, when I was in college, I started realizing I had a little bit of an aptitude for writing, which I ended up with a writing concentration. And I thought I realized at that time it was a big deal to be a technical writer. And I realized, okay, you have engineers. What you do is you try to boil down what they're saying in technical terms and make it in a way that's understandable by the average person. You do that, and you are an engineer. So how is it that you have, I don't know if it's both sides of your brain working, But you not only understand the processes, but you also understand how to explain it to people that can perfectly understand it. And that's not easy for every engineer, but that's really defined a lot of what you've done over the years. And I'm talking from a journalism point of view, not just what you've done in the paddock. So do you realize that you're kind of special in that aspect, or what's your perspective on that?
Well, I think first of all, I had a younger sister who's 7 years my junior, and she wanted everything explained. And I think I enjoyed physics because it explained things that were familiar to me. For example, I wrote a piece on boundary layer. Now, the boundary layer, that just sounds like, okay, I'm shutting off here. I'm going to think about girlfriends of long ago instead. But the boundary layer of a liquid, or should say a fluid, because it could be a gas or a liquid, it's the layer near a solid body where the molecules are slowed down by collision with that body, which is either moving through the fluid or in some other way creating a disturbance. And I realized when I thought about it, we've all had this experience. You get in the bathtub, nice hot bath, and it just feels great. And about the time that you're thinking about going to sleep, you realize that you're almost cold. Why am I getting cold? So you stir the water around and you feel better for a little while, but it doesn't last. So then you turn on the hot water. What's been happening is that the water in the bathtub, which is warmer than your skin, is colliding with your cooler skin and losing energy to it. You feel warm because you're getting energy from the water, but the water is losing energy and cooling off. So soon you're surrounded with a layer of cooler water and you're uncomfortable. This is the principle of a jacuzzi. The reason that those water jets are there is to blow that boundary layer off of your skin so that the nice warm water can make you feel like you're very comfortable. Where's my drink? Where's my sandwich? So that kind of thing, I seem to have a knack for analogies, but I don't think I could teach it to someone.
You teach it, Kevin, you teach it every day. I mean, your articles that you write teach so many people. You know you're teaching. You don't know you're teaching. Are you telling a story?
I know that it's of value to a lot of people because a lot of people have come forward and told me so.
Right.
And I think that's grand. And I tell them, thank you for helping me make a living. Because what happens when there's competition between motor racing and the family usually loses. And I couldn't manage that. So I had to quit going, being a trackside guy and just be the journalist that I was for years and years and be there occasionally. I never went to every GP, not even in 1981 when I was with Schlachter, because I went home at about, I don't know, 2/3 of the way through that season.
Why was that?
Oh, well, I think riders are offered a lot of temptations, and Carruthers wanted us to be tightly focused on racing, and it was not easy for that to happen. We had some promising results, but we never put anything solid together. And I would say that in comparison with Irv Kanemoto, Irv knew that the bike shouldn't start if it wasn't going to finish. And I'm afraid I wasn't that good at making them finish. I could make them fast. So things sort of came apart second half of the 1981 season, and I went home, and Richard carried on with the helper that we had with Donnie Dove that we had with us by that time. And they went up to Sweden, and well, it's happened to the airlines. They say, okay, you're all fueled up. The wise pilot says, is that liters or gallons? And they didn't finish the Swedish Grand Prix because liters are smaller than gallons.
Oh, yes. Oh,
Well, it was tough all around. I felt badly about it, but I left them my liter beaker. Actually, it's a 4-liter beaker. And that should have solved the problem. But the easy way, of course, is always to fill the tank to the top. But I like to have the bike finish with the quart of gas in it, because otherwise, why put titanium fasteners on, and why not, bring a clipboard and work on your taxes going down the straightaway?
Kevin, with you, this happens anytime I talk to you. I always have these things that I know I want to talk to you about, but what you say to us is what kind of propagates the next question. So I wasn't going to ask you this, but and I'm going to ask what you're going to think is a dumb question, but you're pretty good about handling dumb questions from people. Better than Kenny is. Kenny called me some names when I asked him some dumb questions, but
He's going to call everybody names.
yeah, and I felt like, hey, that's love, so it's all good. Have there been riders, you mentioned about fuel load, and it's something I hadn't really thought about. Have riders won races because tuners or crew chiefs or even riders understood that when the fuel load was lower at the end of the race, the bike handled better?
I think that in the classic era of FIM Grand Prix racing, that is maybe before 1975, which was the year that every championship was first won by a two-stroke. I think only the professional organizations like MV and the other factories looked at things like that. And of course, the thoughtful privateers like Kell, for example. I'm sure that he told me that he was working on building an engine of his own design at the time that he decided maybe he'd go racing instead. And I think that everyone knows that the motorcycle does a better job in lap time when it's lighter. So that's absolutely true. You would want to finish with enough gas to make sure that the fuel flow is adequate on the straightaway, but you don't want to have 8 or 10 pounds of fuel on board at the finish. Interestingly enough, the motorcycle, two-stroke motorcycle, uses more fuel in first practice, and then it uses less fuel per lap in every succeeding practice, and it uses the least fuel in the race.
What?
And the reason for this is that the rider is, by the time of the race, he has all his shift points and so forth worked out.
Oh,
Now, Schlachter was new to all of those racetracks. He'd never been to Europe. So it was a little different situation than it would have been for Grand Prix regulars who knew their way around all those racetracks. But in the first practice, he would be out there running the engine some of the time outside the power band, where the fuel consumption is very heavy because the exhaust pipe is not functioning as an exhaust valve to keep fresh charge from being lost out the exhaust port, just as the piston is closing it off. But that's the nature of the two-stroke, is the piston is pushed downward by the combustion gas. The exhaust port opens at about half stroke. The pressure falls as the piston goes a quarter stroke, and then the transfer ports open and fresh charge rushes in. Well, it rushes in traveling a well-defined loop where it's guided by the cylinder walls and the cylinder head. And if the engine is below its operating speed, that transfer loop will reach the exhaust port sooner than it should, and some of the charge will be lost. That makes the fuel consumption much heavier. But even when the engine is on the pipe and everything is working perfectly, those simple crankcase scavenged two-stroke engines used about 30% more fuel than a four-stroke. Because of that loss out the exhaust port.
Right.
And the thing about the transfer ports and the timing of all of those things that are going on in the cylinder and the effect of the various lengths and diameters of the exhaust pipe is that it's an organ pipe connected to a piston engine. And so the power is never going to be any wider than, well, for instance, the TZ750, the torque doubled at 9,300. So that meant you couldn't ride through 9,300 RPM in a corner. It would knock you down because the torque jumping up like that was just too much. And that's why riders talked about, Mick Doohan talked about it, Mike Baldwin talked about it. Ride in the linear region, which is above the torque jump. That's where the pipe starts to pump air. On the TZ750, that was 9,300 RPM or so, and the engine might then peak at 10, somewhere between 10.3 and 10.5. Privateers always work their hardware harder, so Toomey pipes allowed you to rev your engine to 11, but it didn't widen the power much. So basically, you're riding an organ pipe which plays one note. It's the one note samba.
That's right.
Now, that's not just a two-stroke problem, because the Manx Nortons that so many riders came up on in the 50s and 60s, they didn't run real well below 5,500. They called it megaphonitis, but what was happening was that waves in the exhaust pipe were interfering with the carburetor's ability to deliver fuel, so that if you tried to open the throttle at 5,000, you would get this gobbling and, whoa, did you want something? I'm not sure what it is. So then the engine would pull strongly from 57 or 58. And then in the 50s, at least, it would be all done at 6,800. So once again, that's a pretty narrow power band. And that's why guys that had 4-speed Maxes paid extra money to get a foreign-made 5-speed or even a 6-speed. Because as everybody tunes on their engines, the power gets narrower and you need more gearbox speeds. Because if your engine won't pull when you make the final upshift to top gear, if that upshift pulls the revs down to where the engine won't pull, you're screwed.
Okay, this is going to be a pretty, it'll end up being a question, but
Okay.
Obviously my father's education is a zillion times different than yours. His education as far as working on motorcycles came from him trying to make his own motorcycles handle better and go faster. And in those days, that was grinders and hacksaws and all the stuff that you also used.
Sure.
Are those days completely gone? Are those guys completely gone, or do they just work in a different way, obviously, than what they did back then? But he was able to turn what he could do into a second career beyond racing. But I think a lot of that had to do with his experience from racing, so he knew how a motorcycle worked and he knew what he had to do to make it better. But in today's day and age, are those guys completely gone, or are they the guys behind the computer?
I think this is the reason that Irv Kanemoto was all done in 2005, was because the factories had decided, okay, these bikes that we've built are the equivalent of F-22s that cost $300 million apiece. And you are not going to take this F-22 to Barry Sheen's garage and saw the steering head off it and weld it back on at the angle that it should have been in the first place. Because the reason that Kell was so valuable to Yamaha was Yamaha didn't have the experience that he had. They only had engineers. And remember that Mathers at American Honda said, the closest we let the engineers come to our race bikes is the loading dock. He said, all right, here's the situation. The hay is mature and it's dry, but the sky is darkening and the baler is broken. Who do you get to fix the baler so that you can get the hay in and not lose it to moisture and mold? Said if you get an engineer for that job, he's going to take 6 months and write a report. Then you may get the baler fixed. So you get a farmer, because a farmer has experience with that baler and he knows the hay has got to be in the barn by 5 o'clock. So that's why all of those European teams had to have a practical man as crew chief, because he would say, all those bumps at Assen, we're going to have to run a little different float level. That straightaway at, what's that German track? It goes up through the woods.
Nürburgring.
We have to be a little rich because of the oxygen coming out of the forest.
Wow.
And sure, engineers could go in there with a percentage, a 5 gas meter, but they'd write a report. And even guys that are used to California racing, if they have to change an ignition system really quick, you need somebody that puts a wrench on the rotor bolt and hits it with a hammer. Not somebody that's looking around, oh, I've got a rotor holder here somewhere in my toolbox, let me look for it. No, you've got to put a magneto on there now, or you won't race. So you need people, you need a trauma doctor, that's what you need. Somebody who can say, here's where this poor bastard is losing the worst blood, we'll fix this first.
Triage. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. So that's why when the 0W, what was it? 54. Later in 81, arrived in Europe, Kell was dismayed because he said, they've done it again. They've made the transfers too high. And so he took the cylinders off of this precious prototype and he machined the base so that he could lower the transfers, and then he recut the exhausts up higher where they belonged. And it worked.
Wow.
And having the knowledge to do it isn't enough. You also have the courage to realize that if you don't do it, you might as well not do anything.
Kevin, I got to talk to you about something. My gosh, you just said earlier something that so the Nürburgring, because there was a forest nearby, and from I don't know what branch of science it is, but at any rate, plants give off oxygen and take in carbon dioxide. That's our nice synergistic relationship we have with plants. So you're saying if there's a forest nearby, there's a lot more vegetation that is giving off oxygen.
Well,
so
people believe it.
What's
People
that?
believe it. I don't know if it's true.
Okay. That I've never heard before. Wow, because
Yeah.
obviously on a two-stroke, that's so important. Well, I guess it is on anything, but that
And when you talk to somebody who's been around GP racing years and years and years, somebody like Dennis Noyes, and you say, oh, well, the weather forecast, blah, blah, blah. And he then says, well, pulling out one of those incredible Spanish names from his memory, he says, old so-and-so used to phone a friend who lived in this certain city because he knew that the weather they had would be the weather at Madrid or wherever in 8 hours.
wow.
And we know also that Stanley Woods, who was a tremendous racer from the 20s and 30s, was dissatisfied with Norton's reporting system. So he stationed his own people around the Isle of Man track where they could get to a phone. And they would provide him with information that otherwise he would have to wait until, 37 2/3 miles per lap. You were only going to be able to see your board 6 times. So I think there have been individuals who showed the way in professionalism, but their methods were not widely adopted. And I think this is one reason that motorcycle racing appeals to us so much more than, say, Formula One, because in Formula One, we know that there are maybe two or three teams that are serious racing, and the others are grid filler that have been arranged there, funded by internet monsters or Russian oligarchs or South American riders of the Pampas who have good for nothing sons that they want to have a good summer. Here, you drive a Formula One car. It's cool. You'll love it. So do the girls.
They do.
Whereas in motorcycle racing, it's like a steam locomotive. You can see all the parts. You can see things happening. You can see them turning a bike that is just garbage after a crash. 20 minutes later, it looks brand new. But we've all seen the scramble that it takes to accomplish that. And I think it's the degree to which you can grasp motorcycle racing that is responsible for so much of its appeal. And characters like Kel and Irv Kanemoto and Kenny Roberts, when he first rode the 0W54, he said, if this is all they've got for me to ride, then we can give up on the championship right now. And of course, he didn't win it that year either, but he came a lot closer. He won, for instance, at Monza in the rain. And afterwards, he said to me, the fastest bike wins in the rain because everybody tiptoes through the corners and the bike that's quickest down the straight wins. That's less true now that you can see the tremendous angle of lean with rain tires. This last one in Argentina, there they are with the elbow and knee on the pavement.
It's amazing. Yeah. It's incredible what they can do.
Yep.
Hey, Kevin, so I don't know, can you give us and give the listeners a little bit of your resume for people that might not know? And I mean, it's really, I believe you started at Cycle, then went to Cycle World, but there's a lot more to it than that. That's a pretty simplified version of your moto journalism background. Can you give us a little bit of that, where that started in it?
Well, Cook Nelson was he went to Princeton. He came from an equestrian family, and he was expected to become a mounted gentleman of Maryland or what have you. And instead, he lived in a loft apartment in New York City and had a Harley fuel dragster in the apartment. So his approach to the magazine business was very different from the previous. He was going to turn it into a readable consumer book of the modern type. And he decided that he wanted some kind of an insider in racing. And I had, for 1971, I wrote a thing called the working title was The Military Strengths of the Powers. A kind of an analysis of what the different race teams might bring to Daytona. And I sent one, I wrote it for Bob Hansen, and I sent one to Cook Nelson, and I sent one to Cycle World. The Cycle World one went in a circular file. Cook Nelson came to see me at the racetrack, and he said, I want you, this was 73, I want you to write the classic high school essay, What I Did Last Summer. And so I wrote a story about Cliff Carr and myself going racing with a barn job H2R 750 Kawasaki. And Nelson bought the story, and he bought other stories from me. So that was a kind of a start there. And he was, as I say, was at Cycle. And when both magazines belonged to the same organization, they decided to close out one of them, and Cycle got the axe. And that was October of 91. And I got a call that said, or was actually from Steve Anderson. He called and he said, you're going to be asked to continue with World, and you should ask for this bonus. And I said, actually, what I'm going to ask for is to join the middle class. So when they flew me out for a meeting, which I had requested, and I told them, I can't do what a lot of your guys do, which is to work for pay that is essentially my own adrenaline. That's for younger people. I have a wife and a couple of children now. So I need 50 grand, and I need to be getting it regularly. I can't do this feature story business. And so they said, oh, well, this is a surprise. We'll have to talk to New York. And I thought, yes, they didn't say no. They said they would talk about it. The next morning they said yes. So we could occasionally eat in a restaurant after that. That was cool. But previously at Cycle, Schilling decided that he would have to have some monthly columns. And one of them was a technical column. And I think what they had in mind was how to extend the life of your battery, how to break in your new bike. And I ended up with that column. They originally intended them to be written by all of us in rotation, but nobody wanted to do it. So that was a wonderful thing for me because I had to learn to write short. It was 1,000 words, or somewhere between, around 1,000, 1,100 words. So writing short is always harder than writing long.
Yes.
And it's a valuable skill if you're trying to do a good job of explaining one thing, to get 1,000 words in which to do it. So I appreciated that. I had a lot of fun with the column was called Top Dead Center, TDC.
Yeah. Did you come up with that name, Kevin?
No, that was their deal.
Okay.
I'm not good with titles anyway. But at one point when I was still with Cycle, Schilling was a couple of months behind with my checks, and I said, "What about this? Can't we have some agreed time that a check would go out? For example, when you buy the story, I get the check." "Oh, well, mumble, mumble." And I had some inkling of what a terrible thing it was for poor Phil to have that magazine dropped on him when Cook Nelson gave 2 weeks' notice. Because Phil was like Lieutenant Bush in the Hornblower series of naval epics. He didn't want to be in command. There was a wonderful cartoon that was put on Phil's door at one point that showed the tropical island paradise, 2 palm trees, and a hammock slung between the trees. And Phil, absolutely rigid, is lying in the hammock, touching it only with his heels and the back of his head. Phil just didn't want to be editor-in-chief. So I thought, well, I'm going to write something for Cycle World, and I did. And Phil called me on the phone and he said, Splutter, what's going on? And I said, these guys pay promptly. Well, we can do that. Well, why didn't you? So I never thought of myself as having a head for business or being a boardroom negotiator, but I needed that money, so I made a couple of plays, and it went from there. One big difference, of course, between Cycle and Cycle World was at Cycle, the feature was 2,500 words, and it was easy to, come up with 2,500 words on the Cosworth, the terrible Cosworth twin. But over at World, it was 1850, then it was 1500, then it was 1350, because my new editor, David Edwards, was visually oriented, and I could understand that. I mean, we all like a picture book. And the way to get adequate number of pictures in is to cut down on the it's like racing at Daytona, all that droning between the start and the finish. What do? Eat more of those burgers. Well, there's all that droning in a magazine article. Blah blah blah, piston speed, mumble, squish band, etc. So now we're seeing this as a deliberate policy in MotoGP, is that they're seeing that Formula One is having considerable success with never mentioning the word tire again. David Edwards at one point forbade me ever to use the word chatter in his book.
Oh, I've heard that, Kevin. There are guys in the paddock that won't let you say chatter. It's crazy. Yeah. Yeah.
So, in fact, when Kenny Roberts agreed to write something for one of my books, a foreword, I guess, and he said, actually, why don't you write it and I'll sign it? And so I said, well, I'll send it to you and see if you can sign it. So I sent him a first try, and he said, you don't mention chatter anywhere. You got to mention chatter. So I was delighted with that.
Kevin, so I want to describe you. I've never told you this, and my knowledge and understanding of you comes from years and years of reading your stuff, and then finally having the absolute pleasure of meeting you. And then when I get to see you, talking to you, and now I've called you, and I think you're a national treasure. I really do. But I want to say something. Whenever I ask you, well, how do I put this? Whenever I read one of your stories, your columns, or whenever I come up to you and speak to you, it feels like in both cases, I'm coming in on a conversation that's already going on. And unfortunately, I have to leave the conversation before it's done. And it's the same way when I read your stuff. It's the same way when I talk to you. Does that make any sense to you?
Well, the thing is that we've all dealt with similar problems. I'm just now reading Pete Zylstra's account of the development of the XR750, which is a wonderful thing. And it has in it so many experiences of which I have had a similar kind, so that it makes it seem as though we're in a continuum. All these stories are going, not all of them are audible, but when they become audible, they're recognizable to us. And I think that, well, for example, we've all heard about Lockheed's Skunk Works.
Yep.
Lockheed Skunk Works was aeronautical engineers acting like Carruthers. When the SR-71 Blackbird was first built and flight tested, they found that the forward part of the wing structure was stressed almost to the yield point. And so they had a meeting and they decided, well, let's just curl that son of a bitch down some. We'll just angle this part down. And they got the fabricators on it, and they, that frightening hooded cobra look that the SR has with the turned down leading edges. That was done exactly like Kel going to Barry Sheen's shop and sawing the steering head out of one of those Yamaha treasures and welding it on at a different angle, because they knew that it was very wrong the way it was. It was close to failure. In order to more evenly load the wing structure, that's a delta wing, and a delta wing has many wing spars in it, whereas a normal long slender wing has a main spar or a box beam. But they were using their sophisticated experience to say, let's unload those forward spars by curving the wing down at the front. So I immediately feel a kind of, I've been there. I know about this kind of craziness, but I think that what offended Irv Kanemoto about modern MotoGP is that it has become more formulaic. Oh, well, we're at such and such a track, then we have to use this setup. And we have to remember that the normal distribution of intelligence in the human species is also present in the garage area. There are some really smart people there. There are competent people. And then there are people who are facing too many choices and don't know what to do about it. And I think we saw that this past weekend in Argentina, that some people were out there on the racetrack just spinning and not knowing why. And other people were finding that, like Miller, they shortened the wheelbase like any good dirt tracker would do when you don't have grip. And they had grip.
Kevin, I want to talk to you about, we're running a little bit out of time, but I want to talk to you real quickly about something a couple of articles, stories you recently wrote. One of them was very interesting, and Paul and I kind of share the same thing, and I think you do too. This advent of baggers, and we're like, what fresh hell is this when it started, right? And
Yep.
then we're like, oh wow, okay, look at these guys, look how fast they can go, look at how much their lap times are going down, look at the lean angle. And you touched on a lot of that in your article, but the one thing that really got me was the one that was the follow-up about when you said you kind of compared it to the birth of Superbike. And that really hit home for me, because they did look at those early Superbikes as bizarre contraptions, probably the same way we do on those baggers. Can you talk a little bit about that analogy that you did? Because I thought it was brilliant as everything you do, but spot on to, and really, really contemporary to what we're dealing with right now.
Well, I think for example, there have been people, 28-year-olds who made a lot of money in the internet, and then when the internet bubble burst, they lost all their money, and they were very upset about it because they'd seen the tide come in, but they'd never seen it go out. And I think that when you look at MotoGP, it looks like the World Bank. It's this smooth, professional-looking facade, but it has to come from somewhere. And we all know that Carmelo and Mick Doohan were talking about it, and Doohan said, "What the hell? Give him a leader." And that's the informality behind the formality. The AMA had the sense in 1985 to run the 200 as a superbike race because the bikes had matured enough to finish. But if they'd tried to do it in 1980, they might have had 5 machines running at the end, because those early bikes were not well adapted to racing. They were 1960s chassis, tires, and suspension with 135 to 150 horsepower engines in them. And the rider, it was up to the rider. Hey, see what you can do with this, man. And the results were pretty spectacular sometimes. So when those big leader bikes started to hit the market, people naturally went racing with them. And remember, Cook Nelson referred to Pierre de Roche as Pierre de Dit, because he never could get his carburation right. He had so many carburetors and so many setups and so many ideas. And that's why Rob Muzzy said, work on any one thing until you get it about 80% right, because by that time, something else needs your help more. And so there was a beginning in sort of private experimentation, people building hot street bikes. Let's put a cam in this Z1 and see if we can break the taillight lens quicker. And that became heavyweight production in the AMA. They thought we'll have a class for RD 350s, and we'll have to include one for these new Kawasaki's and Suzuki's. But people liked the class. Soon it turned into the premier class in the US. And the Japanese saw that those motorcycles that they were building in the 70s were unsuitable as racing, as a basis for a racing class. So the next street bikes they built were much more capable, starting with the Honda Interceptor and the Yamaha Seikas and the Kawasaki Ninjas and what have you, Suzuki GSXRs. And people immediately began racing those new and more competent bikes. And the result was super sport. This is what all the regional organizations did. They said, these people want to race these bikes. Let's have a 600 class. Let's have a 750 class. And we won't let them do a bunch of modifications because we want to have lots of entries. And it was tremendous for a while. So I see these classes coming into being as a result of what ordinary folks owning motorcycles are doing. Souping up their bikes, racing them with minimum modifications like brake pads, tires, alternative suspension. But no living on the dyno and trying to develop the way they were doing with those big super bikes in the 70s and early 80s. So that's the way it looks to me. That's the way these classes came into being.
Sean, you know those conversations you said you've had with Kevin, and you always feel like it's not, you have to leave before it's over?
Oh, totally. Yeah, that's what it is.
We have to leave before this is over, because Zoom will basically pull the plug on us, and I don't know what happens when that happens. I don't know if we lose what we have. So we need to wrap it up, Kevin. It's funny. I've always envied Kevin, because I feel like I'm pretty good at telling people what happened, but technically I don't have the ability to tell them why it happened. And that's what I think is the thing I look forward to with Kevin when I read something, is he can look back at a motorcycle race and tell me why things happened based on technical reasons that I wouldn't ordinarily know. But
Yeah.
The one time that he did make my day, I used to write a silly watercraft column every month. And one time he told me that his wife loved my watercraft column. And
Wow.
That's right.
That-
That's absolutely right.
so I may not have impressed every member of the Cameron family, but I did impress his wife. So I'm going to take that
Awesome.
and run with it. But
Yeah.
Kevin, it's been awesome having you on the show. And we say this to a lot of people, that we need to have them back. But with you, we seriously need to have you back. And I probably need to upgrade my Zoom subscription so that I can go longer than an hour, but it's all we've got at this point.
Sure.
Kevin, will you come back on with us?
Oh,
Of
sure.
course he will.
Yeah.
Fun.
Love it.
Anyway, it was a pleasure. I enjoyed every second of it, as I know Sean did as well. So again, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you down the road at one of our races.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.